Yeah, so we just kind of wanted to start off before we get into the actual interview questions. We just wanted to ask you really quick, just sort of like, how did you come about focusing on an ethnographic work in the train network in Tokyo? Was there any sort of specific inspiration or passions that sort of drove you into this very niche like field of study?
Well, I missed the train. That was the main inspiration behind the book. Is I went to Tokyo. I think I'm at the end of my second year of graduate school, Columbia, and then I was looking. I think I was looking for something about technology and mediation, and I went out to a poetry word slam in Shinjuku, and I was living in Higashi Koganei at the time, so it's on the Chuo line. And I went out to a poetry word slam, which was really interesting. Was just a lot of fun. And we went out for drinks after that, and the usual thing in Japan. And then I realized that I couldn't get home, so I spent, rather than just finding a McDonald's or something, just I can't sit still. I'm the kind of person who can't sit still. So I decided to walk around Tokyo all night. So I walked from like 12 or 12:30, 12:50 in the morning till like 5 in the morning. I just walked around Tokyo all night. And I really enjoyed it. But I realized there was this whole other city that happened in the space between the last train and the first train. And so I started thinking about gaps, about the spaces of in-betweenness. And so the first title was Aida no Jikan, like the space of the time in between times. And so I became interested in the kind of social life that the train is sort of, that it's able to constitute, and the assumptions that when the train's operating, you think in a certain way. Then when it's gone, the city just sort of became very different. I think it was like a Friday or Saturday night, and all around Shinjuku Station by morning, there were like drunks thrown up all over the place, people falling asleep. But by 7 o'clock, it's like Disneyland. Everything had disappeared and everything was clean again. It was like the world had vanished. But I had seen that evening, and then, so that became part of my fieldwork. So once a week, I would stay out every night and walk the city. Right? It got left out of the book. I did a lot of walking around the city. I mean, I just had a course that would just walk the city every night. I would meet all these strange people, and I would sit out all night in the summer and talk to people, on the little ramen stands that they push in the street in Shibuya and Shinjuku. And it was exhausting. I'd come back the next morning and sleep, but I would just walk the city once a night, every week.
Wow.
And I kept a schedule. That was the really important thing. I kept it like a schedule. Like every Wednesday night, I did this. So I had certain people I kept meeting. So it's another book, maybe.
It's really cool.
Yeah, but that's how the idea came on. Then I got into the train.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's excellent. So the next two questions that we're going to ask you actually are ones that Andrea had requested we ask everyone who were the class is interviewing for this project. So this is a class about reading, slow reading, and kind of slowing ourselves down as we approach new concepts to not like foreclose where they end up going. So we wanted to ask you what is reading to you, and what are your favorite forms of reading?
So reading for me is difficult. I'm dyslexic, so I struggle to read. So I have to read very, very slow. And that, in some ways, it forces me to slow down. If I want to understand it, I have to slow down. So I have to reread sentences a couple times. I have to really work through a paragraph, and I have to understand it before I can go on. So I just naturally read very slow. And it's always somehow I feel inadequate when my colleagues just like blow through books and they get it really quick. And I'm like working really slow to get through a book. But because of that, I enjoy the challenge of working through a book that forces me out of a comfort. It forces me to take on a different worldview. And so I like books that challenge my worldview and that are initially when I go to read the book and it's exciting because I don't understand it, but it's a puzzle I have to work out and I have to slow down and work it out. So reading for me is that process of slowing down to work out. But I also, when I'm reading about my topic or something, when I'm reading for inspiration, I think one of the best things that was said to me by my advisor, Marilyn Ivey at the time, was back in Columbia, and I keep to this day, is never read on your topic. Never read about your topic. Always read around it. And so if you're reading things about your topic, you're just going to reproduce the same kinds of thoughts and things. But if you, read anything around something that's tangentially related, but read around a topic, never on it. And so for me, I think I pull most of my inspiration these days from science fiction. I particularly science fiction that has a sort of philosophical bent to it that I just love. I find so much inspiration from there. So I read a lot of fiction, a lot of science fiction, and then I'll read anything that around the topic that's kind of a puzzle. I don't like books that just tell me what I kind of already know. Right? And there's a lot of work that synthesizes knowledge. And so it does a really good synthesis, but it doesn't do anything transformative. So I like books that force me into a transformative position, that once you've read it, you have to see the world differently. So I like that. And that's a challenge. It's like a insight each time. I like that feeling. So I hope that's a good answer.
I wonder if this reading around is somehow similar to your idea of thinking with rather than thinking about. And I guess
yeah, that's part of the thing with the book. And the last thing I wanted to do was to try to claim to read a book and know a lot about the train system in Japan didn't seem like it was very significant for me. What's the point? It's changing all the time anyways, but to use the system in order to think differently was, for me, that was doing more interesting work. So I didn't want to do I'm going to tell you all about Japan and the Japanese and the train system. I didn't want to do that kind of representational work. I wanted to do something that had a more kind of emergent and performative aspect to it.
Yeah, I guess that's also related to our second question. Is in the class, we have been discussing a lot about the unthinkable and also alternative ways of thinking, as Marcus mentioned. So we wonder, what are your thoughts on ethnography or technography as a way of thinking, and whether it allows us to approach the unthinkable?
Yeah, it was a really good question. And I wrote down this, I started writing about it and I wrote down this long answer. I can't read my writing notes. It's I'm looking at it as you're talking, I'm like, what? Yeah, hold on, let me try to read my writing. What did I write? Yeah, so one of the things that when I read that question that I thought was interesting is that lately I've become more and more interested in how and why the question of unthinkability even becomes a problem. So so that's always been something that with in Japan, of this idea of sotegai, something that's outside the parameters of thought, that can't be thought, that's somehow unthinkable, is somehow that which needs to be thought to solve all the problems of technology and whatnot. But then I started, I think I've become more interested in the question of why unthinkability has become a problem, particularly around what it's called the complexity turn of the post-cybernetics 1970s, where everything is suddenly so complex that you can only think within partial ways. There's this kind of, to borrow a phrase, a kind of bounded rationality that can only deal with so much because otherwise it's too complex, and why complexity is somehow this challenge, but something that we all have to aspire to, and how unthinkability becomes sort of a sign of complexity. So I'm really interested in that aspect of why unthinkability has even become interesting for us and why it's a question. But when you ask me sort of what it is, in the relationship to ethnography as a way of thinking specifically beyond sort of received frameworks, one of the presuppositions of the book that I draw from someone like Thomas Lamar, who was a media thinker, and philosopher and art critic, and all these other things, biologist and all these other things, One of the things I draw from him is the idea that he has in his book, The Anime Machine, that is that thinking on the train, the kind of thinking that you do on the train is going to be radically different from the kind of thinking that you do off the train. And the reason that thinking is never thinking, we have this idea, this enlightenment idea of this bounded, autonomous, rational subject that is sort of this complete space of internal thought, the interiority, the place where great mind thinks. But that's, I mean, it's foolish to think that we think disassociated from our environment, with kind of like detached objectivity from our environment, that we can be subjects and distant from our environment. Thinking for me is always a kind of distributed thinking that's always going to be happening with the people and non-people and the elements and the people and humans and non-humans and animals, right? That are in my environment. So it's always in situ, it's always related to that, but it's always those things change how I think. So one of my favorite things is to sit on the couch and pet my, the cat always sits next to me. It's just my little, but when he sits next to me and he purrs and I'm writing, I'm thinking with my cat. He's like, he's part of that moment. And my kids have totally changed the way I think. Having a computer, that's also something for me. Like, I dropped out of school because I couldn't think, because I couldn't write. So I dropped out of school for 8 years because I couldn't, I couldn't work and I couldn't create sentences. But being able to think with a computer and then just sort of change the way I work out sentences and stuff totally changed the way I think. I mean, it allowed me to think. So I think we think with things, and we have to pay more attention to the environments in which we think. And so ethnography for me begins in the field. All your questions begin in the field. It begins by, it's almost sort of this gonzo moment. If you throw yourself in Hunter Thompson gonzo journalism, right? Where you throw yourself into a situation and then write about it, right? So the questions have to always be stimulated from encounters. And so the field is an encounter with new ways of thinking. And for me, one of the things that people that I take from here is someone like Simon Doan, whose thinking is always a transductive process, right? It's always a kind of, it's always a transformative process that it's, to say it's sort of an individuation in progress, like it's a becoming in progress. But it happens in relationship to things that exert force on you, and then you exert force on it, right? And like you affect and they affect you. So it's this kind of like thinking that's very different, has to be situated somewhere. So I'm very much, a lot of times the questions have to be driven, your questions have to be empirical. The site doesn't, I mean, in terms of empirical studies, I'm not set on that, but the questions have to be empirical. They have to be born of an actual encounter. Right? So that's how I think of thinking in the field and ethnography in general.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So the next question we have is sort of focused again around Reutemann and crisis in general. So within many chapters, there's mention of different forms of crises that arise within the commuter train network, either from some sort of technical error or human interference, unpredictability from the gap of indeterminacy. Crisis from the ideas of Reutemann can actually be influenced and determined by very situational factors or by individuals of power in higher positions, etc. So within the commuter train network, we get an idea of where these sort of crises form, and how standards of crisis are formed that may look different from an outside perspective. So one example that stuck to my mind was just the different sections on the commuter suicides and how that sort of is handled through many different parties and how different people sort of react to it. So our question with this was, instead of where, how do you think these crises in the train network are formed? And then so also like who declares a sort of state of crisis in regards to the commuter network?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I this is one of the questions I kind of struggled with, because and I have to admit that I haven't opened the book. I wrote it and I can't bring myself to open it. I worked so long and it's just like, I go back and I read parts here and there, but I just could not bring myself to go back to the book. So I'm kind of drawing on my memory. So I apologize. I'm sure when you finish your books, you'll feel the same way. But it was a long process because it was only 1,000 or 1,500 words from the actual dissertation that remained in the book. So it was a total rewrite. And right, so the idea of crisis, I think the time when I was thinking, you know, the problem for me was that the crises were always kind of in the community network were dealt with as functional problems that could be overcome through a sort of provisional resolution of immediate conflicts in the field, right, in the system or immediate conflicts. And they never took on the valence of crises per se. I'm thinking here, I was very influenced early in my thinking by Eric Kasdan. I don't know if you know who that is. He's a Japanese film media critic who went later and wrote stuff about his experience with cancer, and he wrote a book called Already Dead about coming to the United States or moving from the United States to Canada and trying to deal with leukemia and the medical system there. And it's really interesting. So very almost ethnographic, autoethnography of his second book. But he wrote a really interesting article as part of a whole special edition, I think it was an SAQ, called Crisis, Catastrophe, and Revolution. And his point was that crisis is supposed to do a certain kind of work. And I think Reutemann is saying the same idea. Crisis does a certain kind of conceptual jolt. I mean, it's supposed to lead to catastrophe, then revolution. It's supposed to, I mean, he's obviously Marxist, so, you know, for him, the dialectic that's supposed to be the engine of, you know, transformation of society is derailed somehow. Where crisis never achieves the real value of crisis in terms of forcing an actual worldview change for people. And I think we kind of see this right now in the United States, where like crisis has been kind of, we're living in a sort of perpetual crisis that is never brought to the level of catastrophe and revolution. We're never forced to actually, we're never held accountable for putting in place the system that will create that crisis. And so for me, the crises in the commuter train network are really moments in which there's a chance, especially for like the body on the tracks and stuff in that chapter, there's a chance for people to recognize a kind of, recognize the body, to recognize what life has become in capitalism. And there's a failure to recognize it, or sorry, failure to acknowledge. I think I use the word recognize, but without acknowledging, right? They recognize the body, but they don't acknowledge it. And I think that for me, that's a failure of crisis. And I think, you know, someone else, Joe Maskell also writes, for example, The Crisis in Crisis, where the crisis of the 1960s around the potential nuclear apocalypse actually led to a kind of document of world coordination to prevent it. Where now we have a crisis of the Anthropocene, a crisis of climate change, where that crisis is, we manage the crisis, but we never really solve it. We never, you know, we're gonna end up one day with catastrophe, but will it end up with revolution? Or by that point, you know, it might be too late, who knows? Might not be anybody left to have a revolution, right? So for me, crisis is really a question of sort of a jolt that's supposed to lead to social change. And I know that's falling into whole Reutemann's thing of crisis and innovation. Crisis, it becomes this engine of epistemology for her, right? It becomes a sort of this, because she's reading Koselleck, right? She's reading Crisis and what was Koselleck's work? I forget the name of it. But she's reading that, and she's doing sort of a step back discursive analysis of crisis and its role in history. Right? History is always told in a series of crises, and what they do for, you know, a notion of history is making these kinds of progression. So I know that's sort of falling into that, but I think crisis is supposed to be a wake up, right? And it doesn't have to be the question of what went wrong. It can also be the question of what do we do from here, right? Like, how do we fix it? Who do we hold accountable? And do we hold ourselves accountable? And there's supposed to be a moment of reflection in crises that somehow through our crisis management, we are able to not recognize or not realize that moment of crisis or sidestep it, right? So that's really what I was thinking about with crisis. Let me know if I don't answer anything well enough now.
Yeah, that was perfect.
It's better. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the next question that I'd like to ask is about kind of broadly the distinction between machine theory and STS. That was something that grabbed me immediately just in the introduction of the book, of where you kind of draw these lines to carve out what machine theory is. and the way that you kind of, contrary to the figure of the cyborg or to like Haraway's work more broadly, are figuring the machine and the human as inherently separate, and then it's their interplay that kind of comes to make this co-constitutive collective life. And that was very odd for me as someone who's been like trained in this cyborg tradition. Like that's where my STS thinking.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, reading that article was like mind blowing when I read it. You know, her Cyborg Manifesto, and that book to me, it was fantastic. It changed my view. Right. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So I was also thinking with like how Haraway's ethical relationality is kind of coming from this like initial, I don't want to use the word indeterminacy, but like it's, there's no like prefigured entity before the relationship.
Right.
And she draws that from Barad.
Right.
So I was really interested in hearing about like technicity and the kind of ethics that it carries, because this is a very different way of figuring ethics out of this machine-human relationship than the one that Haraway and Barad are kind of playing with. So I'm wondering if you could like fill that in a little bit more, and then I'm also
so the term technicity obviously is coming from Sidney Mondon, who has a kind of ethical it's more than subjects. He's very clear at points what are the ethics of technicity and how it involves a kind of technical mentality, right? And it's supposed to be a particular relationship to technology. For him, the problem with capitalism can't be solved through the question of structural inequalities around labor, and it can't be resolved through economic. It has to be resolved through our relationship with technology. So for him, that's the fundamental, that's the overarching relationship of the human in the world, is that question, is that technological question. What is our relationship with technology? And for everything comes from there, right? And so for me, the reason, drawing that distinction between humans and machines, like, we aren't machines and we aren't going to be machines. And it comes back to the idea that thinking is situated, but it's also embodied. I do my best thinking when I'm running. That's when I have to move around a lot. I have to move, I have to get out, I have to run. And then I'll be running, and if I can riff off of Joe Dumit here, my body thinks and my brain runs, right? It happens, I need to move, right? So, but that's because I'm a human, right? And gravity is important to me. Things hurt when we are very embodied. Thinking is very embodied, and a machine, who knows what metal will think like, right? We are different, and we incorporating metal into our bodies and whatnot are not going to make us. It's a very literal sense of what she means by cyborg, but it's not a fusion. The whole point is that machines are of value to us because they are different, because they are not human, because they are not organic, and they have a different sort of potential trajectory for becoming that humans don't. Humans have a different potential trajectory for becoming. So the question is to enable both those trajectories for becoming through the interaction, right? So there's something of the machine in us and something of us in the machine. There's a co-productive relationship that's not a merger. It's the holding apart that enables the relationship, not the conflation. And so for me, that's very important, because that holding apart demands that you constantly recognize the difference and you work with it. And that's what the commitment to working out that difference, the commitment to making space to let that other part in, to be part of you, but to remain separate from you. So that's very important. It's like a relationship, right? A good relationship is one where you don't lose yourself in the other person. You remain different, but every day you recognize that you change and they change, and every day you have to make the commitment to start again in some ways, to work with each other and allow for that change to happen. And for me, that's what a healthy relationship is, even with another person. And it goes back, I think, to like Haraway's discussion of her dog. And the whole point is that the dog might bite you, but it's not your best friend, right? A dog is a dog. And trying to make it, oh, it's almost human. It's almost belittling of dogs. The point is that it's a dog, and my cat is a cat, and I think great being when he's there, not because he's so almost like a child next to me. No, he's a cat, and I got to be careful sometimes because he might get pissed and bite my finger, right? But that's the point, because he is not human. That's the point that demands that I accept that difference, that I negotiate, that I make a space and commit to working out that difference, and allow him to be a cat at the same time that I can be human, right? So it's that the ethical part comes from the opening up spaces for entanglement. And that's kind of what the chapter on forgiveness was about, right? The need to sort of the forgiveness is the opening up of creating yo-yo, creating leeway within oneself for a kind of difference. So that's kind of my position on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun to talk.
So here comes the next question.
Okay.
I don't know
This is
if
the Days of Love and Labor one, right?
I don't know if it is totally viable to compare like your text with like games or gambling machines, but like I'm very fascinated by how like games like Days of Labor are specifically designed for the train card, and it is the environment of the train card that compelled players to invest in the game. So I mean, if we could make that comparison, what do you think would be the train card for your book? Like have you, yeah.
That's a really tough one. It's a great question. It's completely unexpected. So it's a tough one. You know, the thing is like academic reading for me, because my book is, I've had people tell me like, couldn't you write it a little bit easier? There are parts that are a little bit dense, and I get that because it's just somehow, I need to do that. That's how I like doing ethnography. But so for me, academic reading requires a kind of attention. I mean, the book itself is, it should be an immersive experience that you really get into it, and you really, and it's not that, I think that for me, I need quiet places to read, right? I need I need to be able to focus. So for a book like that, a book like this, I would hope that people could read it in a place where they could really develop a particular kind of intense attention to their reading. So I think that for me, that intense attention is different from the kind of productive distraction that happens with Days of Love and Labor, which it's purposely not a very what's the word? A very expanded, precisely developed interface, because it's purposely left open, right? Because you can then absorb other parts from your surroundings. So I think that the fact that it doesn't require that kind of attention, but for me, academic reading requires an intense attention. But that just might be me. I don't know, because of my difficulties with reading. So, but I would not be able to read this book on a train. Walk it on a train.
Yeah, no, I share that. Like any sort of the books that we read for this class, I had to be in a very, very specific setting to read.
What else did you read? Tell me.
Yeah, so we did, like I mentioned, Bach, Between Matter and Method. We did Wagner, I believe, for The Invention of Culture. I might be mixing authors. Strathern with Relations.
Sorry, my thing is cutting out.
Oh, you're good. Yeah.
Did it Strathern? Which Strathern?
Relations. So just yeah, the overall account of relations with her. We did Trilo, doing some stuff with like history, accounting. Am I missing any? Oh, we did Daston, Lorraine Daston, very more recent.
Oh, wow, it's a great class. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, it was probably the most wide range of anthropological reading and non-anth reading that I've done for a course, which I've enjoyed a lot. So, yeah, especially relations, I think for me was my my big takeaway, which is kind of why I structured the final question around relations. So there are many layers, obviously, of relations at play within the commuter train network that are described as contributing to the network's technicity. Marilyn Strathern, in her book, makes distinctions between kin and relations, emphasizing how in more of the Anglophone perspective, relations are heavily based on notions of recognition, distance, context of time and space. So the question we came up with is, could interactions between commuters be seen as definitive relations or more of connections made through some sort of shared experiences? And how do the circumstances of commuter relations contribute to technicity as a whole? Are the relations created more empirically or exterior to the network, or are they more?
What do you mean by empirical? That's I was sort of thrown off by that. Empirical or exterior to the network. Can you elaborate on
Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. Let me see if I'm remembering my thinking right. So going back to Strathern, she made some sort of distinction between how um, sort of like sometimes relations I think are very fundamental, or they kind of don't really need any sort of like foundation for them necessarily. So like if you use recognition or some sort of like sliding scale of distance based on how you say someone is closely related to you, I think that's kind of where I was going with empirical or exterior.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was kind of more, I guess, to rephrase the question, um, are the relations that are formed in like a train car, for example, are they reliant upon the train car itself or some other form of like element within the network?
So there, I mean, those relations. I mean, part of what I tried to show in the first chapter is that there's a kind of the one could track the whole socio-historical uh, culture of the train system around the relations of lining up and the way in which the system itself kind of imparts or asks commuters to perform a certain kind of behavior, and how that behavior, it works in Japan because they've been doing it for, they actually went and made people line up, and then they tested it, and then people didn't always line up that way, but it's become part of a kind of a culture of riding the train, where you know how to ride the train, right? You prescribe to a certain kind of manner, right? So those relationships are more sedimented within the larger framework of the cultural history of Tokyo and Osaka, and places where people have to manage these tight relationships. So I think that that's what the first two chapters try to map out, tell the story of the emergence of those kinds of relationality. But then it comes down to those relationships are constantly being reformed and rewritten every day with the train, because it's never the same thing, right? So you can't just have people performing as automatons, because everything's changing all the time. So it's the necessity for both to work out that relationship between the train system changing every day and the people having to accommodate, but the people also changing. So it's never the same system every day, even though it kind of has a sort of repetition to it. So the thing that I think, I mean, if I were to rewrite this now, I would draw on, has anybody been watching The Expanse? No? Oh, you should be watching The Expanse. You should really watch The Expanse. It's really good. And yeah, it's really good. It's one of the best science fiction. I mean, it's kind of like after Battlestar Galactica, where do you go? Well, you go to The Expanse. Right? It's like, it's a whole future imagined around class relationships that are determined by gravity in some ways. So it's really interesting, because gravity changes the bodies and that changes the workers. It's really interesting. Anyways, so in The Expanse, there's this idea of the doctrine of the one ship, right? So the people who are born and live out in space have this ingrained behavior of the doctrine of the one ship, that everybody recognizes that their behavior is part of the ship, that there are certain things you just wouldn't do, because you would be the whole environment is so precariously held together that you have to constantly work with each other, even though nobody says anything. Everybody knows that they have to work with each other to preserve the environment for the ship to function, and whether that's on a space station or wherever. But the people who can't take gravity, who can't take environment, who can't take air for granted the way that people on Earth do, have to understand that they are all compressed into one single environment where one person can destroy it for everybody. So there's the doctrine of the one ship, and everybody collectively together on the one ship. And so reliant on one another, whether they say it or not. So there's almost a kind of doctrine of the one ship. That's how I would, if I were to rewrite it today, I would borrow from The Expanse, and it's almost kind of, it's sort of like what I think Buckminster Fuller tried to do with Spaceship Earth in the 1960s, to get people to actually think in terms of the doctrine of the one ship. We're all on one ship, we need to take care of it, but it's really hard because, you look up in the sky and it's like endless expanse, right? But if you look up and you actually see the end of your world in a bulkhead or something, you get it, that we are now in a very precarious situation, that it matters how I behave, and that how any one person can undermine the fragile environment. So the doctrine of the one ship, I think, is sort of a mentality that I would say that pervades the commuter train car. And it's kind of an ingrained sociality that's recognizing the precariousness of the given environment, and very technological, the technicity of that environment. That's a collective formed it's a technological collective formed in a very precarious relationship with a technological condition. So that's how I would think about it today if I were to rewrite the book. But you should watch The Expanse, seriously. It's really good.
Yeah. No, I wrote it down.
Okay.
Now. Yeah, that's kind of like why I spurred this question. It was just this like such an intriguing way that how people can like have this very, very similar shared experience that happens almost daily. For there to be very like restrictive and like very defined forms of relationship you like create, but then when that form is sort of broken, that's when you kind of see like that relate, because it's kind of like invisible almost, like with the example of how there was like that one interaction where the woman noticed like someone not on the train when she like normally sees this person, and she was kind of like concerned. So it's like in those moments where you sort of like break away from that, that's when you sort of see this relation. And it kind of, I feel like you can sort of see that in a lot of different scenarios for like, a university campus, for example. You sort of like see these people and have these relations, but it's some sort of event that sort of brings those relations into a different perspective. So that was
it's understanding that there is no such thing as independence.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of an American perversion of liberal autonomy, liberal notions of autonomy. Autonomy is not independence. Autonomy is recognizing that your capacity to act depends on the field, depends on the people around you whose behavior is a condition of possibility for your actions, right? So it's a kind of recognition that there's no, to borrow what you were saying before, EJ, there's no kind of ontological priority of the individual. That there is no such thing as an individual that precedes a collective, right? It's just a very skewed way of thinking about things. It comes from the philosophical notion of a state of nature in Western liberal thought, right? Where there's the individual nature, then the individual comes out and signs a contract and joins society. No, there's no individual that precedes a state of nature. There's just there's no relation that precedes its relatedness, to borrow from Haraway, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are all good questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. That was our final question that we had. So EJ or Jojo, if you guys had any final thoughts or anything.
Not particularly. Thank you so much for your responses to our questions. I have like so many notes and a lot to think of, and your explanation of like trajectories, using that word in your response, I needed to like dwell on that for a second.
Okay.
That's really like opened up a lot for me. Yeah.
Well, it's always fun. I mean, it's just great to feel that someone reads it, and there are flaws with it as there are with every book, but it's a work in progress that was abandoned at some point and was published on the point of its abandonment. So it's just how things go. But thank you very much for reading it, and thank you for asking me such great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Yeah.
Sure. All right. Have a good weekend. Stay safe and keep the faith.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.